The sky above in Cheon was a sickly gray, the color of bad luck. In the narrow alley behind a dimly lit restaurant, Kyung-mi heard the gunshots before she saw them. One after another, rapid, like a heartbeat going too fast. She froze, her breath shallow as the sound rattled her bones. Then she saw him. The boy. The man now. Who she had tried to forget for so many years. He stood there, his back to her, with blood streaked down the side of his face, a gun in his hand and fury in his eyes. His name was Jin-ho, the boy she'd raised as her son, but he wasn't the same Jin-ho. "Mom, get inside. Now." His voice was low, but it cut through the air like a knife. Kyung-mi stood paralyzed. The alley was thick with tension, the air charged, like a storm waiting to burst. She saw the man lying at Jin-ho's feet, his body twitching in the final throes of life. A world of memories, the boy she'd taken in, the child who once clung to her as if she was his only anchor, came flooding back, but all of that felt so distant now, like a dream from another lifetime. The man in front of her was not the same boy who had clutched her hand for warmth all those years ago. "Why, Jin-ho? Why?" She barely recognized her own voice. His eyes flickered to hers, colder now than she'd ever known them to be. His voice came out with the same intensity, but there was something different in it. "You should have known. You raised a monster." The words sliced through her, and with them came the realization that everything had been a lie. The quiet boy who once called her mom had vanished into the shadow of a mafia kingpin, a man responsible for the bloodshed around them. And now it was her own son who had ruined her peaceful world. Everything was falling apart, just like the storm. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Years ago, Kyung-mi had been a young woman trying to survive in a city that chewed people up and spat them out. She was a single mother, struggling to provide for her own son, young Jae, who was just a toddler. She worked long hours in a small convenience store, often too tired to even cook dinner for her boy. Then one rainy night, as she was closing up shop, she found him. A boy, no older than 11, drenched to the bone, his eyes wide with fear. He was huddled in the corner of the alley behind the store, his small frame shaking from the cold. Kyung-mi's heart had ached for him instantly. She took him in, fed him, and gave him a place to stay, even though she had nothing to give. She didn't know his name or where he came from, but she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility for him. The boy never spoke about his past. Days turned into weeks, then months. Jin-ho, as she later named him, became part of her family, an inseparable shadow. He was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but he was kind, especially to young Jae. He had a natural way of looking after him. Despite their modest means, their home was filled with a warmth that Kyung-mi had never known. Her own son adored Jin-ho, and she saw in him the son she always wanted. But there were signs, small at first, that Jin-ho was hiding something. He was too clever, too intense for a boy his age. One night, Kyung-mi had caught him sneaking into the kitchen with a strange, nervous energy about him. She'd tried to ask, but Jin-ho had brushed her off, telling her it was nothing. That was the first moment her instincts told her that this boy was more than he appeared, but it was too late to turn back. She had already become too attached, and so had young Jae. They were family now, for better or worse. The years passed in a blur of routine. Young Jae grew up, bright and hopeful, his laughter the music of their home. Jin-ho, on the other hand, continued to stay in the background. As he entered his teenage years, his reserved nature became even more pronounced. He was distant, often disappearing for hours, returning with a strange air about him, as though he was carrying the weight of a world Kyung-mi couldn't understand. One evening, a man knocked on their door. Tall, dressed in a sleek suit, his presence filled the room like a cold wind. His name was Mr. Park, and he was looking for Jin-ho. At first, Kyung-mi was polite, but confused. Why would anyone be looking for a boy she had raised in her home for years? "You're looking for him?" Kyung-mi had asked, but Mr. Park's eyes didn't meet hers. He wasn't there to ask permission. He was there to deliver a message. Jin-ho had been watching from the stairs, his gaze sharp, like a predator sensing prey. Without saying a word, he descended, his footsteps quiet, deliberate. "Go inside, Young-jae," Jin-ho had said to Kyung-mi's son, his voice soft but firm. Young-jae hesitated, sensing the tension in the air, but he obeyed. And just like that, Jin-ho left with Mr. Park. The man's visit had lasted only a few minutes, but the unease lingered for days. Kyung-mi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She had always known Jin-ho was special, but now, for the first time, she wondered just how dangerous he had become. Years went by, and Jin-ho became a man. The boy who had once been so innocent, so vulnerable, had transformed into someone else entirely. He no longer needed Kyung-mi's care, nor her protection. He had climbed the ranks in the criminal underworld, his ambition burning hotter than anything she could have ever predicted. Kyung-mi heard rumors, whispers of a ruthless mafia boss, a man who had risen from the slums and built an empire with blood and violence. No one dared speak his name out loud, but everyone knew who he was. The thought twisted inside Kyung-mi like a knot that she couldn't undo. Could her son, her adopted son, really be the man they spoke of? She tried to confront him. She had to know the truth. She had to ask him if he was the one who was behind the chaos spreading through the city. But when she finally found him, it was as if she was looking at a stranger. "Jin-ho," she asked, her voice trembling. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me you're not that person." His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, a darkness, that passed through his eyes. "It's true," he said quietly, "and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Her world crumbled in that moment, and as the days passed, the city around them descended into chaos. Her son, the boy she had raised, was now the monster responsible for the bloodshed. And yet, there was something in his voice, something in the way he spoke, that told her he wasn't fully lost. There was a part of him that still remembered the boy she had taken in so many years ago, but it was too late now. The damage was done. The war Jin-ho had started had begun to take its toll. Businesses burned, families were torn apart, and the streets ran red with violence. Kyung-mi watched helplessly as the city she had known all her life was reduced to rubble. But the most painful blow came when Jin-ho's forces came for her biological son, Young-jae. It was a quiet afternoon when it happened. Kyung-mi was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the familiar sound of boots on the floor. She turned around to see Young-jae, wide-eyed, standing in the doorway, his hands shaking. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Jin-ho. He's coming for me." Young-jae's words hit Kyung-mi like a punch to the chest, knocking the air out of her even though she stood completely still. The kitchen lights flickered above them, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, making everything feel distorted, unreal, like the world had tilted sideways. She reached for her son's trembling hands, but the moment her fingers touched his, he jerked back in fear. Not fear of her, but fear of what was coming. She had never seen him like this, not even as a child. His eyes darted to the front door, then to the window, as if expecting someone to burst in at any second. "What do you mean he's coming for you?" she whispered. The words scraped her throat as they left. Young-jae swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling too fast. "Mom, I saw his men watching me. Not once. Every day this week. And today, one of them told me to prepare to meet the boss. He squeezed his eyes shut, voice breaking. He said Jin-ho wants to talk to me alone. The kettle on the stove clicked off with a sharp pop, making both of them flinch. The silence afterward was thick, suffocating, full of things neither dared to say. Kyung-mi's mind spun as she tried to steady herself, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. She had spent years trying to keep her two sons, one born of her, one taken in, safe under the same fragile roof. But now that roof felt like paper, and the storm outside was no longer a metaphor, it was real, violent, and closing in. She remembered the first night Jin-ho came home with bruised knuckles, how he avoided her eyes and claimed he had fallen. She remembered the day he walked into their home with a wad of cash wrapped in rubber bands, insisting it was payment from a part-time job. She had ignored all the signs. Every warning her instincts screamed at her. Maybe because she wanted to believe kindness could heal anything. Maybe because she was afraid to lose him. Now that fear had become her punishment. Young-jae stepped closer to her, lowering his voice to a shaky whisper. "Mom, I think he believes I betrayed him. I think someone told him I'm talking to the police." Kyung-mi felt her heart split, a tearing pain she could almost hear. She grabbed his shoulders firmly, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You haven't, right?" Young-jae shook his head violently. "Never." Footsteps echoed suddenly from outside, the heavy, synchronized steps of men moving with purpose. Young-jae froze. Kyung-mi rushed to turn off the lights, plunging the kitchen into darkness except for the pale moonlight leaking through the curtains. Her breathing grew shallow as she pulled her son close, pressing a hand over his mouth to quiet him. The sound came closer, then stopped right outside their door. Through the thin walls she could hear the rumble of low voices, calm and confident, like predators discussing their next move. A cold sweat slid down her spine. Young-jae's pulse raced beneath her fingertips. Then came the knock, slow, deliberate, almost polite, which somehow made it more terrifying. Kyung-mi knew that rhythm. She had heard it years ago, when a younger Jin-ho used to knock softly so he wouldn't wake Young-jae. Now that same rhythm felt like a threat. "Open the door, mother," Jin-ho's voice called. Not loud, not angry, just firm, certain, full of a familiarity that made her want to scream. Young-jae startled, but Kyung-mi kept her hand over his mouth. Another pause followed, heavy with unspoken intent. "I know you're both inside," Jin-ho continued, voice darker now. "And we need to talk. Don't make me break the door." Kyung-mi had no choice. If she stayed silent, they would come in by force, and Young-jae would be dead before she could do anything. Her hands shook as she slowly released her son and turned toward the door. "Stay behind me," she whispered, barely audible. Her feet felt like lead as she stepped across the living room, each movement cautious, the wooden floor groaning under her weight. She opened the door only enough to look out, and there he stood. Jin-ho. Older, broader, face carved with cold authority. His black suit glistened with raindrops, and behind him stood 4 men, silent and unmoving. But it was Jin-ho's eyes that froze her, the same eyes she once comforted after nightmares, now empty and unreadable. "Mom," he said softly, a bitter echo of a memory. "Let me in." She hesitated, searching his face for any trace of the boy she loved. His jaw tightened, just barely. "Please." Something in that fragile word made her open the door fully. He walked in without waiting, scanning the room with sharp precision. Young-jae stepped into view and Jin-ho's gaze locked onto him instantly. The tension between them crackled like a live wire, ready to snap. Jin-ho took a slow step toward Young-jae, and his men shifted slightly, hands near their coats. Kyung-mi quickly moved between her sons, spreading her arms like a shield. No, she said, louder than she intended. If you want to talk, you talk to both of us. Jin-ho stopped. His expression wavered, something small, something human flickering for just a second. Then it was gone. Young-jae, he said, voice controlled. Someone inside my circle told me you're leaking information, that you're trying to destroy everything I built. Young-jae's voice cracked. I never betrayed you. You're the one who destroyed everything. His words sliced through the room, sharp and painful. Jin-ho's jaw clenched. Rain pounded harder against the windows, mirroring the tension. Kyung-mi felt the air tighten as both sons stared at each other, one filled with fear, the other with a dangerous mix of doubt and pride. Then Jin-ho leaned forward, eyes narrowing. If you're innocent, prove it. The challenge hung between them like a blade. Kyung-mi realized this was no conversation. This was a test, one that could end with one son killing the other. And she knew with chilling certainty, whatever happened next would change their family forever. The silence in the room was suffocating. Kyung-mi's heart raced as she watched her two sons, one born from her, the other raised by her hands, face off in the kind of standoff only the darkest of family secrets could create. Jin-ho stood still, his cold eyes fixed on Young-jae. Kyung-mi could see the weight of the moment on both of them, the tension so thick that even the air felt wrong. She stepped back slightly, instinctively, but her mind screamed for her to intervene. Please, Jin-ho, she said, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't the way. Her son, the boy she had raised, the one who used to fall asleep in her arms after nightmares, was standing before her now as a man who had become a stranger. His hard eyes didn't soften, nor did his lips twitch with the faintest hint of familiarity. This man wasn't the boy who had cried in her arms when his past came rushing at him. This was a boss, a killer, someone who had crossed the line between family and empire. And in that moment, Kyung-mi realized that whatever he had become, it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Young-jae's gaze was filled with defiance, his chest heaving with the kind of fear that could fuel rage. The air around them seemed to vibrate with an unspeakable energy, the tension coiling tighter and tighter like a spring ready to snap. His voice broke the silence, shaky but fierce. You've lost yourself, Jin-ho. This isn't you. You were just a boy who needed love, who needed someone to show him kindness. Look at you now. His words struck like a slap. Jin-ho's eyes flickered for a brief moment. Something soft, almost imperceptible, before the ice-cold exterior snapped back into place. He inhaled slowly, as though absorbing the weight of the accusation, but didn't react. The world doesn't work that way, Young-jae, he replied, voice low and controlled. I didn't choose this life. It chose me. And if you think I'm going to let anyone, especially my own blood, destroy everything I've built, then you're wrong. There was a finality in his tone that made Kyung-mi's stomach turn. Her mind screamed at her, begging her to reach out, to make him remember. But the look in his eyes, the same cold, calculating look that she had seen in his men's eyes, told her that the boy she had raised was long gone. The seconds stretched, and Kyung-mi felt as though she were suffocating in the air between them. She had always known that Jin-ho's path wouldn't be an easy one, that his past would one day catch up with him. But never had she imagined it would come to this heartbreaking collision between the love she had for her sons and the monstrous empire Jin-ho had built. She stepped forward, desperation in her eyes. Jin-ho, please, don't do this. This isn't the answer. Whatever they told you, whatever happened, this isn't you. She reached out for him, hoping that somewhere in that hardened shell he would hear her. But Jin-ho took a step back, his cold mask falling back into place. His eyes flickered to Young-jae one last time, his gaze lingering, calculating. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, his voice almost tender, but there was no warmth there. You raised him to be a pawn. I gave him a chance to prove his loyalty, but he failed. And you?" His eyes shifted to her with an unspoken challenge. "You've chosen him, haven't you?" It was a simple question, but the weight of it fell heavily between them. It wasn't about betrayal, it was about the choices she had made. Her love for one son over the other, the fractured loyalty that had been growing for years. Kyung-mi didn't know what hurt more, the accusation or the truth that followed it. She had always believed she could save them both. She had always thought that love could heal anything. But now, standing between the two men she loved more than anything, she realized how naive she had been. She could feel the shift in the air, the moment when everything had gone too far. Jin-ho, the boy who had once clung to her for protection, was no longer the same person. And Young-jae, who had once believed in his older brother's good heart, now saw nothing but a cold, dangerous stranger in front of him. The finality of it all hit her like a punch in the gut. She wasn't strong enough to fix this. She wasn't strong enough to make the right choice. "You raised him like your son." Jin-ho's voice cut through her thoughts. "But I was your son too. And now, look what it's cost me. Look at what I've had to become." He took a step closer to Young-jae, his hand drifting toward the inside of his coat, where the familiar outline of a gun glinted faintly. Kyung-mi's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a family feud. This was a battle for survival, for dominance, and there was no easy way out. Suddenly, Kyung-mi's thoughts snapped into focus. This couldn't end in violence. Not here, not now. There was still time to change the course of this nightmare, to pull them back from the brink. But how? Her eyes flickered between her two sons, the same two souls she had once held in her arms. And then, with an overwhelming surge of emotion, a thought struck her. She couldn't fix everything, but maybe, just maybe, she could still save one of them. "Jin-ho," she said, voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "If you love me, if you remember the boy you were, the one who once cared about family, then let us go. Let him go. I won't fight you anymore, but I won't let you destroy him too." Her plea hung in the air like an echo, both hopeless and full of desperation. Jin-ho's eyes softened for a moment. He lowered his hand from his coat. "I wish it could have been different, Mom," he whispered. Then, turning on his heel, he motioned for his men to leave. As they filed out of the house, Kyung-mi felt the weight of their departure crash down on her. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The war was only beginning. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Kyung-mi stood frozen in the living room, her body aching as though the ground beneath her had shifted and she couldn't find her balance. Jin-ho's departure hadn't brought her relief. It had only deepened her dread. The man who had once been her son was still out there, still leading the criminal empire that had consumed her family, and now, her biological son Young-jae was caught in the middle of a war he never asked for. He was standing by the window, eyes glazed as he stared out at the rain that continued to beat against the glass. She knew that look. It was the same look he had when he was a child, when he thought the world could be made right with enough love, enough patience. But now, the innocence had gone from his face, replaced by something darker. "He's not done with us, Mom," Young-jae said, his voice hollow. "This is just the calm before the storm." Kyung-mi swallowed hard. She wanted to deny it, to tell him everything would be okay, but deep down, she knew he was right. Jin-ho wouldn't stop until everything he had built was either destroyed or protected, and that included them. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. A week passed in a blur of quiet dread. Kyung-mi tried to keep things normal for Young-jae's sake, tried to make dinner, fold clothes, as though this was just another stretch of life, just another day. But nothing felt normal. Every knock on the door made her heart race. Every shadow outside their windows made her flinch. Jin-ho's men didn't return, but their presence loomed over everything. It wasn't just that her son had become a monster. It was that she had failed him. She had raised him with love, yes, but she had also raised him in ignorance. She had protected him from the harsh world outside, but she never fully understood the darkness inside him. The truth was, he had been dangerous long before he picked up a gun. Kyung-mi tried to tell herself that she had done the best she could. She had offered him warmth, care, safety. But the violence in his heart had been seeded long before she had found him. And now, it had grown into something monstrous. She couldn't help but wonder if she could have done more, been more for him. Could she have saved him from the life that awaited him? Or had she been doomed to fail him from the start? Kyung-mi's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of the phone on the kitchen counter. She hesitated before answering, knowing it could be another warning, another threat, or perhaps news of something far worse. "Hello?" Her voice cracked as she picked up the receiver. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a voice she recognized immediately. "Mom." It was Jin-ho's voice. She froze, her heart slamming into her ribcage. He sounded distant, as though miles away, but also strangely tired. "Jin-ho?" she whispered, almost afraid to hear the words that would follow. "I need to see you," he said flatly. "I'm coming by tonight. Don't tell Young Jae. I'll explain when I get there." And with that, the line went dead. Kyung-mi stared at the phone for a moment, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to reject his call, to turn away, to shut the door once and for all. But she couldn't. Her heart ached with the hope that maybe, just maybe, he was coming back to her, coming back to the family she had once tried to protect. But then again, she knew him now. She knew the game he was playing. And no matter what, she had to be ready for whatever he was about to throw at her. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, as though the storm inside Kyung-mi's heart was matching the fury of the one outside. She had no idea what to expect when Jin-ho walked through that door. Was he coming to end everything, or was he finally ready to make things right? There were moments, fleeting ones, when she almost convinced herself that her son was still in there, buried beneath the layers of power and control he had built around himself. But each time she looked at him, she saw the shadow of the man he had become. She saw the mafia boss who had no room for compassion, no space for weakness. When the knock finally came, Kyung-mi felt a chill run through her. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door, before opening it to reveal Jin-ho, standing tall and imposing. His eyes were hard, but there was something else there, something unreadable. Behind him, his men waited in silence, hands in their coats, eyes scanning the surroundings. Jin-ho stepped inside without a word. "You wanted to talk," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her own fear. "So talk." Jin-ho's gaze flickered to Young Jae, who stood behind her, his body stiff with tension. For a moment there was a strange calm. Then, Jin-ho spoke the words that would change everything. "I'm going to give you both a choice," he said quietly. "Either you leave this life behind or it will swallow you whole." Kyung-mi's heart skipped a beat. The weight of his words hit her like a freight train. There was no warmth in his voice, no mercy in his eyes. He was giving them a choice. Yes, but it was no choice at all. The mafia world he had built would never let them go. Kyung-mi could see the fear in Young Jae's eyes, the fear that he had never fully understood until now. They were trapped. They always had been. And Jin-ho knew it. "You don't have to do this," Kyung-mi said, her voice hoarse with emotion. "We're your family. You can leave it all behind. You don't have to kill everything we ever had." Jin-ho's eyes flickered. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped short, his gaze shifting to his men. It was a moment too long, a moment where she saw the crack in his armor, the briefest hint of hesitation. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "I can't, Mom," he said softly, almost regretfully. "This is who I am now. This is who I was always meant to be." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Kyung-mi standing frozen in the middle of the room. She could feel the weight of the decision crushing her, knowing that the storm was only just beginning, and they were about to be caught in the eye of it. The night after Jin-ho's visit was unbearable. Kyung-mi couldn't sleep, couldn't find peace. The house, once filled with the mundane sounds of life, now felt hollow. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Young Jae barely spoke at all, his face pale, his eyes distant. She could feel the rift between them growing, widening with every breath they took. She had tried to protect them both, but the truth was undeniable now. They were trapped, each in their own separate cages. The world Jin-ho had chosen was a prison, and her son had already lost the key to escape. Kyung-mi went to the kitchen, hands shaking as she prepared tea, her mind replaying everything she had learned about the boy who once called her Mom. How had it come to this? How had the kindness she'd given him been twisted into cruelty, into the brutal force that was now his identity? She could still see the moment when Jin-ho had stood in the doorway, that faint, almost imperceptible sadness in his eyes. But it wasn't enough to change anything. He was lost. And so was she. The next morning, the phone rang again. Kyung-mi's stomach churned as she reached for it, the dread rising like a tide in her chest. When she answered, it was a voice she didn't recognize, a harsh, gravelly tone that sent a shiver down her spine. "This is for your own good," the man on the other end said, his voice low, cold. "Jin-ho's not happy with the way things are going. He's going to take action. If you don't want your son to end up as collateral damage, you'll do exactly as we say." The line went dead before she could even respond, leaving her holding the receiver, her mind spinning. She turned to look at young Jae, who was sitting at the table, staring blankly at his plate. He didn't ask who had called. He didn't need to. Kyung-mi knew he had heard the conversation. He had seen enough of Jin-ho's world to understand the language of threats, of power, of fear. The weight of the phone call hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. She had no answers for him. She had no way of protecting him from what was coming. No way of protecting herself either. As the day dragged on, Kyung-mi couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every hour that passed, she felt the walls closing in on them tighter and tighter. Jin-ho's empire had already reached too far into their lives, and now it was threatening to consume them whole. The fear in young Jae's eyes had shifted, had turned into something darker. Resignation, maybe even guilt. He couldn't say it, but she knew what he was thinking. He was the reason everything was falling apart. He had trusted his brother. He had believed in the man Jin-ho once was, and now he was paying the price for that belief. Kyung-mi's heart broke for him, for the innocence he had lost. She had raised him to believe in good, to see the world as something that could be made better. But now the world was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She moved across the room, kneeling beside him. "Young Jae, listen to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that I love you. I always will. And I will never blame you for this." He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with unspoken sorrow. But before he could respond, the sound of a car engine rumbled outside, and Kyung-mi's blood ran cold. The car stopped in front of the house, the low hum of its engine signaling the arrival of what Kyung-mi knew would be their final confrontation. She glanced at young Jae, who stood up, his posture rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had grown up in the shadow of Jin-ho's world, and now that shadow was about to consume him. Kyung-mi stood as well, her legs shaky, but her determination holding her steady. "Stay behind me, Young Jae," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. He didn't argue. The knock at the door came, slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down to their inevitable end. When she opened it, there was no trace of Jin-ho's humanity left. He stood there, flanked by two of his most trusted men, his face stone cold, his eyes devoid of warmth. His gaze flickered to Young Jae for only a moment before returning to her. "It's time, Mom," he said, his voice flat. "The deal's been made. You've chosen your side. And now you'll pay the price." Kyung-mi's breath caught in her throat. She had no illusions left. There was no saving them. Only one thing mattered now: survival. Without a word, Jin-ho stepped forward, his men flanking him like shadows. Kyung-mi felt her heart hammer in her chest as she stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching out for Young Jae. But he wasn't there. He had already moved, stepping in front of her as if he was trying to shield her from the storm that was about to hit. Jin-ho's men moved toward the back of the house, their eyes scanning every corner, every window. They were preparing for something, but Kyung-mi couldn't fathom what. Jin-ho's gaze never left her. "You've made your choice," he said again, his words slicing through the thick silence. Kyung-mi's chest tightened. She had never been more afraid in her life. Then, without warning, a loud crash erupted from the back of the house, followed by shouting. Kyung-mi's blood ran cold. She looked at Jin-ho, her mind racing. This wasn't just a threat. It wasn't just a warning. This was the beginning of the end. The storm was here, and it would tear everything apart. As the first shot rang out, she knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The sound of gunfire echoed through the house, a sharp, violent crack that sent Kyung-mi's heart racing. The walls trembled with the force of it, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched Young Jae rush toward the back door, his face a mask of determination and fear. The world outside had turned into chaos. Jin-ho's men were closing in, their footsteps heavy, synchronized, moving like wolves on the hunt. Kyung-mi wanted to scream, to call out, to stop him, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. The world felt as though it had stopped spinning, and in that frozen moment, she saw her son, the boy she had raised, step into the line of fire. She wanted to shout, to beg him to stop. But it was too late. The distance between them felt endless. She could hear the crash of furniture being overturned, the thud of boots hitting the floor as the men moved inside. They were coming for them. And there was no way to hide from what was about to happen. Kyung-mi's mind raced, panic setting in as she glanced around the room, looking for any way out. The house, once a symbol of warmth and security, now felt like a death trap. The door to the backyard was just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. Young Jae was already outside, his silhouette barely visible through the rain-soaked glass, moving quickly toward the alley behind the house. He was trying to escape, to protect her, to protect himself. But the reality hit her like a wave. They couldn't outrun Jin-ho's men. Not this time. Jin-ho had always been 2 steps ahead, always in control. This was his world, his game, and they were nothing more than pawns. She could feel her legs trembling, her whole body betraying her, but she forced herself to move. The sound of her own footsteps seemed so loud in the silence that followed the gunfire, a relentless reminder that time was running out. She reached the front door, her hand hesitating on the handle, her thoughts a storm of fear and regret. She wasn't just fighting for her son's life anymore. She was fighting for their future, for any chance at redemption. The weight of the choices she had made pressed down on her like a heavy stone. There was no escape, only one path forward. Outside, the rain had become a downpour, soaking everything in its path. Kyung-mi's eyes darted between the alley where Young-jae had disappeared and the house, knowing Jin-ho's men were closing in on both sides. She could see the figure of her son ahead, moving with a desperation she had never seen before. He was trying to reach the alley, trying to get to safety, to break free of the nightmare his brother had dragged him into. But the sounds of gunfire and shouting were getting closer, and the shadow of Jin-ho's men loomed over the night. Kyung-mi reached for the door, stepping outside into the rain, feeling the cold water hit her skin like ice. The world seemed to slow down, the chaos around her muffled as if she were caught in a dream. Everything felt surreal, as though the violence that had invaded their lives had become a part of the air they breathed. She heard the crunch of gravel beneath her boots as she moved toward the alley, her mind consumed with fear for her son's life. But as she reached the corner, her eyes widened in horror. Young-jae was already surrounded. They had him. Kyung-mi's heart exploded in her chest as she saw the men, Jin-ho's men, closing in on her son. The fear in Young-jae's eyes sent a sharp pain through her, cutting deeper than any bullet ever could. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Her pulse raced, panic flooding her veins as she rushed forward, her legs feeling like lead beneath her. "Young-jae!" she screamed, but her voice was drowned by the pounding of the rain, the thundering of her own heart. The men didn't move, didn't flinch at her cry. They were only waiting for Jin-ho's signal. Her mind spun as she reached him. Throwing herself in front of her son, her arms wrapping around him instinctively. The cold rain drenched them both, but the fear in the air was hotter than any fire. "Get out of the way," one of the men growled, his voice rough. But Kyung-mi didn't move. "I won't let you take him," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. The man raised his gun, and for a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. But before he could pull the trigger, a voice rang out. "Stop!" The voice was unmistakable. Jin-ho. Kyung-mi turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she saw him standing at the entrance to the alley, his silhouette barely visible through the rain. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on her, then on Young-jae, his eyes narrowing with something that almost looked like regret. The men hesitated, their guns still raised. But they didn't move. Jin-ho walked toward them, his footsteps slow and deliberate, each one making the air feel heavier. "Put the guns down," he said, his voice hard, commanding. The men obeyed, lowering their weapons, but the tension didn't fade. Kyung-mi could feel it, could feel the moment slipping away, could feel the fracture in their family growing larger with every passing second. "This is the end, Jin-ho," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to destroy us." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to Young-jae, his gaze softening for a brief moment. Then, with a single motion, he raised his hand and motioned for the men to step back. Kyung-mi's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to turn away, to give them the chance to escape. But then his eyes met hers, and his words shattered her heart. "You've lost, Mom. We all have." The family's journey, once filled with love, hope, and dreams of redemption, has come to a devastating conclusion. Jin-ho's empire has crushed everything, and no one emerges unscathed. The choices made throughout this story have shaped their fate. And now, with the final confrontation over, we are left to reflect on the cost of loyalty, love, and the price of blood.